Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture and the paranormal, coming to you from sunny West London. My name is Gordon and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we welcome historian, publisher, speaker and author Mitch Horowitz. Mitch is the author of Occult America, The Secret History of How Mysticism Shaped Our Nation, and more recently, One Simple Idea, How Positive Thinking Reshaped Modern Life. Mitch, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Lovely. Now, I know a little bit of this from your first book, but the traditional question is, Mitch, were you a weird kid?
Oh, I was a very weird kid, absolutely. I loved monster movies, Ouija boards, astrology, Carlos Castaneda. I was taken in by all of that stuff. And in a way, growing up in the 1970s in New York City, it was kind of a wild time. There were all these robed gurus on television, and we would rush home from school to watch Dark Shadows and Twilight Zone reruns. And my sister was bringing home books on flying saucers and Bigfoot and Carlos Castaneda from her school book club. I remember one time overhearing her on the phone with a friend, wondering whether Ringo Starr had shaved his head in solidarity with Charles Manson. There was all this weirdness in the air, and I totally took to it. My friends may have been interested in it in passing, but I was interested in it with a total passion, and I suppose that remained with me into adulthood.
Yeah, wonderful. Did it kind of define, I mean, what were your parents like? Were they open to you having, monster books and all that kind of stuff around?
Yeah, I think they were. They certainly, I remember them buying monster books and such for my birthdays, and I think they were glad that I was reading. It may have caught their eye that I was bringing home books on folklore and spells and mythology, but they were glad that I was going to the library and taking out books. So I don't think it ever gave them much concern.
Yeah, that was mine as well. When I pushed it a little bit and I was after my first tarot deck and the Witch's Bible, I said to my mother, well, at least it's not drugs.
That's right. It's true. In fact, I hear from parents from time to time whose kids are into Wicca and they worry, is my kid getting into Satan worship or something like that? And I often tell them, not only should you not be worrying, but you've got one of the good kids, 90% of the time or more, kids who demonstrated interest in things like Wicca and the divinatory arts and things like that tend to be sensitive, lovely kids with an artistic streak, not the kinds of kids who are getting in trouble. So it's not only something that a parent shouldn't fret or worry over in most cases, but in many cases it says that you've got a sensitive kid who's one of the creative types, who's one of the productive types, who is curious about the world. So it's something to celebrate in my view.
Nice one. So did that weirdness follow you through your sort of studies and out into the career world? Or did you have a prodigal son kind of relationship with the weird?
That's funny. I guess I had a prodigal son relationship with the weird. As I got older, into my late teens and into college, I was more into politics and, wanting to change the world, Bernie Sanders style. And probably in my 20s, I was interested in politics. I was interested in Judaism, the religion that I had grown up with as a kid. But as I got a little older, probably as I was nearing 30, different strands of esoteric and alternative spirituality began to appeal to me. I think I was very interested in whether spirituality could make your life better, whether there was a useful, practical, concrete payoff. And I feel very strongly about that today. Sometimes it's considered sort of gauche or missing the point to expect spirituality to be practical, but I feel quite the opposite, actually. I think that ethical and spiritual and therapeutic philosophies should have a really concrete, definable benefit in the life of the individual, and also make that person better for others to be around. Otherwise, why are we doing it? I have very strong questions about that, and my friends who are deep into esoteric spirituality shake their heads when I say that, because they think, he's missed the boat, he's missing the point. And having been in this world of inquiry for a long time now, to me, that is the point. That is the point. Systems and cosmic theories and trying to understand the layers of existence, or worthy pursuits. But at the end of the day, how are an individual's relationships out in the world? Is an individual a highly functioning, reliable, effective person, not only sometimes, but in the most ordinary hours of daily existence? I feel very strongly that spiritual pursuit is either a code to living, or it very quickly becomes an amassing of a bibliography that no one ever looks at, in a certain sense, within oneself. I think that ethics, psychology, spirituality should be measurable in conduct. And I come to that conclusion after long years searching within esoteric spiritual systems with very serious and good people. The question of a payoff is not gauche or shallow. The question of a payoff, I think, is ultimately where we must come to, or again, we really risk just becoming the compilers of a massive bibliography that fewer and fewer people ever look at.
Absolutely. And you could make the case to your esoteric friends that their metaphysics are a subset of the practical application of spirituality rather than the other way around, because from a historical basis, mankind's first spirituality appears to have been an animistic form of optimizing hunts and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the first thing we did with it was apply it practically. It's only a little bit later that we could sit and navel gaze.
Yes, I agree. I had an exchange not long ago with someone who felt that I was spending too much time on spirituality as therapy. And I said to him, look, I simply don't view it that way. I think that a person could fall to their knees in front of the Beatitudes, for example, and could spend the rest of their life trying to live by any one of those moral precepts that you find within the Beatitudes, and to get inside of it and to really make it something that penetrates one's existence. The problem with knowledge is that it rarely penetrates. There's a brokenness in human nature that allows us to amass information, but not for that information to be felt, applied, lived within ourselves. So I take very seriously simple ideas. I think if an individual were sitting with the Beatitudes or the Tao Te Ching or the Bhagavad Gita or the Dhammapada, that to me is primal wisdom. That's primal wisdom. And the question of whether I can live with any of those ideas, really live with them, or whether they don't penetrate, that to me is a question worthy of a lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the earthing of it. It's interesting if you consider, say, the first path of the moon. You're right that there's a human tendency to accumulate knowledge and kind of get stuck in it. And the first path is one of delusion, of kind of like wandering off. But in between that, you actually have to earth it back down. There's the redemption of the world between the moon and when we get back, and it's this stuff needs to be earthed or practically applied. And what you have as a tremendous defense is the historical precedent. You can say, this stuff isn't necessarily new. You can make the case that it is the oldest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how I feel. And I think you're absolutely right that man's first grappling with something higher was a matter of survival. How can we maximize the hunt? How can we plant in the right seasons? How can we find some way to tilt the balance of the natural world in favor of us? And in a sense, I think that impulse has never gone away.
No, I think I was talking to Dr. Kreipel about this, but culture emerges from, however you want to call it, an interplay between mankind and the spiritual world. And that is fundamentally practical. It was to begin with. And actually, it's kind of a neat segue into when we look at your two most recent books, so Occult America and One Simple Idea. As I read them both, they exist on they're almost a continuation, because Occult America tells the story of kind of setting the scene for how and why America specifically generated this idea that went on to dominate the world but then completely conceal itself. There is something very unusual about, say, the foundations of America being almost an accidental macro ritual.
Yes, it's very interesting. It's funny. There was some decisive change or turning of a corner in the world following the occult experiments of the Renaissance. You had this flowering of a kind of reclaimed spirituality from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, among the intelligentsia in Europe, in Western Europe, through much of the 1500s, but with the death of Queen Elizabeth and tensions between the Catholic Church and various offshoots of Protestantism, because the people studying the occult tradition in many cases did belong to kind of the most radical expressions of Protestantism. These tensions resulted in a backlash, and you had all kinds of events that grew out of the backlash, one of which, and I'm making historical leaps here, of course, but one of which was the 30 Years' War, which was so devastating to Central Europe, even for decades after it ended in 1648. And remarkably enough, at that time, you had different colonies of pilgrims and different commercial colonies settling in the New World, in what would become the United States, and there was a fair degree of religious freedom in the American colonies, relatively speaking. And it was quite remarkable to me that people who were experiencing persecution in Europe, either who were getting battered in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, or who were Quakers and felt they could never fit into Anglican society, or who were being accused of witchcraft and had the means, sometimes just physically, to get across the Atlantic. Word trickled across the Atlantic that there was a possibility to settle in these colonies and escape certain forms of persecution. And enough people made that effort and survived the Atlantic voyage, so that you start to see fairly early on in the life of the U.S. colonies these different pockets of settlement in the United States, whether it be the Shakers or a little sect led by Johann Kelpius. They were sort of mystical Christians from Central Europe who settled in Philadelphia, and the community at Ephrata, Pennsylvania, also a mystical Christian community. You had these little pockets of resettlements in the New World from the occult Renaissance in Europe. And Americans were very interested in these little communities. And of course, Freemasonry became an influence in the colonies and among the founding fathers. And Masonry was, in many regards, I think, a vessel for the initiatory tradition as it was revived and re-explored during the occult Renaissance. So you had all these influences kind of bubbling up in the New World, and it really did color things. It really did give birth to this kind of ethos of religious experimentalism. America very quickly started to mint new religions, Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventism, Christian Science, and even spiritualism and talking to the dead and so forth. That was recomposed from certain theories that had existed in Europe that found new soil in America, and suddenly you have a couple of teenage girls in upstate New York playing around with spirit raps in their log cabin, and it's not many years until you have people living in more developed cultural and financial circumstances in London and Paris and elsewhere, taking up these experiments themselves, and seance circles suddenly becoming the rage among high society. But all that spark of ignition began in this little log cabin in upstate New York. Americans had this quality of spiritual experimentation, and they tended to export this stuff to other parts of the world, especially back home to Europe. So this has all gotten kind of papered over and buried. But America, in addition to being an engine of commerce and other things, was an engine of spiritual experimentation, and it really became the place where the occult renaissance went to live, and it's had a big impact on the world.
It absolutely has, and I'll push that further, because I would say you're talking very deliberately about only the human side of it. But when we're talking about spiritualism, it worked. It got the attention of something on the other side. I mean, tell the listeners what the burned over district is.
Well, it was wild, actually. The burned over district is this narrow swath of land in central New York State that had been home to the Iroquois nation prior to the Revolutionary War. And the Iroquois nation made an ill-fated military alliance with the crown, and things obviously didn't go their way. And after the War of Independence, the colonial government used that as a pretext to do what it had wanted to do for many years, which was to push the Iroquois out of central New York State. And central New York State, running roughly between the cities of Buffalo and Albany, was open to speculation and land settlement, and a bunch of New Englanders flowed into central New York State, which suddenly was this frontier territory, this open territory, and they left behind a lot of their spiritual traditions at home, whether they were Calvinist or Lutheran or Methodist, and anybody who was looking for a following, anybody who had a spiritual idea that they wanted to propagate and was looking for a following also flowed into central New York State, because there were all these new folks there starting in the early 19th century. So for about 50 years, this was called the burned over district. Some people said that was because it was burned over by the fires of the spirit. Another legend says that one missionary told another he was going to go there, and he goes, don't bother with that place. That place has been burned over. Everybody there belongs to some little sect or organization or spiritualist club or something. There's no more converts to be had there. But in any case, the burned over district came to mean a place that was burning with the fires of the spirit. And that was, of course, the birthplace of spiritualism, this idea of sitting around a table and soliciting knocks and communications from the deceased, from the other side, from the spirit world. And spiritualism, in turn, opened the door to the women's rights movement, something that's still not well understood here in America, because women, and this is now in the late 1840s, women could hold no viable jobs in the U.S., but a lot of women found themselves as mediums at the seance table, and that was one of the first public roles that women were allowed to have and were recognized in the U.S. And the suffragist movement and spiritualism, not coincidentally, were born in this same neighborhood of central New York State at the same time in the year 1848. This isn't just a funny coincidence. Lots of the early suffragists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they were involved with spiritualism. They had spent time at the seance table. They viewed spirit mediums, female spirit mediums, as heroes because, look, this was a woman speaking in public, serving as a religious leader. It was absolutely revolutionary. We've completely forgotten that, and there are students here in the U.S. who can study our history, study the women's rights movement, and never a mention of this intersection, this dramatic intersection between spiritualism and women's rights. Throughout the 19th century, there was a marriage between progressive politics and occult movements, and to a degree, that marriage was a ripple that came out of the occult Renaissance. When the occult intellect, when the Renaissance intellect rediscovered Egyptian, Greek, Roman spirituality, there was just no telling where this was going to go. It's extraordinary. It reverberated across the Atlantic, instigated this branch of spiritualism, which came at a time when women were looking for open doors. That became the open door. There's a connection between women's rights and the rediscovery of occult spirituality during the Renaissance. It's a family tree. You can trace it. And we've lost this sense of our history.
Well, we have, and what interests me is if you look, I mean, you'd be familiar with the sort of John Keel concept of things like window areas.
Yeah.
When we're talking about the general New England area and sort of zeroing in on some parts of it, like central and upstate New York, you have a classic example of that is also a UFO hotspot still.
Right.
So what we have is a whole bunch of people engaging with the spirit world in what we would call a window area, and out of that, and this is the kind of getting back to our idea of what practical spirituality or magic is used for, in that interaction between spirit generating culture. We don't just get suffragettism out of it, and this kind of is going to lead us into talking about New Thought. We get as you were saying, there's a lot of progressivist utopian ideals. So tell us, for instance, what was the original formulation of, say, something like the law of attraction?
Well, it's funny. The law of attraction was actually used by a spirit medium named Andrew Jackson Davis, who lived in the Hudson Valley region of New York State, which, as you were alluding, is a big UFO hotspot today. And Davis was a young man who lived in a town called Poughkeepsie in the mid-1800s. He was known somewhat jokingly as the Poughkeepsie Seer. That name was originally intended to make fun of him, but he liked it and he started using it.
It's cool. I'm glad he did.
Yeah, it's cool. And Poughkeepsie was a very important industrial and agricultural city in New York State, and remains so. And Davis, this young man known as the Poughkeepsie Seer, would go into these trance states. He was interested in mesmerism. Again, mesmerism and occult philosophy that traveled across the Atlantic to the U.S. And Davis was interested in mesmerism. He would go into these mesmeric trance states and give these metaphysical lectures, give a whole story of the creation of the universe and life on other planets and wisdom from the angels and visions of the afterlife. And it was Davis in the 1840s who, in one of his books, first used the term law of attraction. And to him, that was not a law of cause and effect here on Earth, but he was referring to the fact that people seated around a seance table will attract the kinds of spirits that are simpatico to the ethics and the character of the people seated around the seance table. And also that we here on the earthly plane have some kind of magnetic correlation, if you will, to different stages of the afterlife. So the law of attraction was basically about how we folks here on Earth relate to the unseen realm, and our contacts with the unseen realm, including spirit voices in the unseen realm, as Davis put it, would mirror our own ethics and character here on Earth. That was the law of attraction. It was just a law of affinity between the earthly individual and the unearthly, unseen spirit being. It was years later, that law of attraction was reprocessed by people who were interested in New Thought, this movement that grew out of New England that said, your thoughts are causative, your thoughts make things happen. Years later, they reprocessed the phrase law of attraction to mean basically a law of reciprocity, that what you think about, you will attract. Like attracts like. That was the New Thought formulation. So law of attraction was originally a concept very much part of the spiritualist era, very much having to do with relations at the seance table. But today, of course, we use it to say like attracts like here on Earth.
Yeah, it's what I love about this book is it's kind of fascinating. A lot of the things we dismiss, and we should rightly dismiss because some are, well, not rightly, but there is a case to be made for dismissing some of the later, shallower manifestations of them. But say the science of getting rich is more common than people realize. Yeah, carry on.
No, the science of getting rich is wild. It was written by a Quaker minister, Wallace D. Wattles, in 1910, and Wattles believed that you could make a serious metaphysical argument that life is perception. And Wattles was a man of the progressive era. He was a socialist, and he ran for Congress and other offices on the Socialist Party ticket here in the United States. And his idea of getting rich was this notion that competitive business was going to be supplanted by a kind of creative utopianism, and that each of us could attract our own beautiful garden to tend, and that as each of us built our own garden, we would come into a world of cooperation and leisure and free time. And Waddles belonged to a kind of utopian socialist movement that was popularized by figures like H.G. Wells, or in books like Looking Backwards, which was a very popular utopian work of the 1890s, which foresaw a world of socialist leisure and prosperity in the American future. And Waddles believed in that, and believed that the mind could play a part in this political revolution. So I remember years ago I was reading The Science of Getting Rich, and I started scratching my head and saying, I'm either going nuts or I'm encountering Marxist language here. And I was absolutely certain of it. You know, he was talking about things like producers and creators, and the era was passing of the competitive industrialist, and the workers and the immigrants and the women would take control of the means of production through this thinking stuff in their mind. And I'm thinking, this is Marxist New Thought, and that's exactly what The Science of Getting Rich is. So, you know, the book gained new popularity in 2007 after the movie and the book The Secret came out, because it was heavily referenced in there, and it becomes number one on the bestseller list of Business Week magazine, and there's all these young go-getters and corporate types reading The Science of Getting Rich, which I applaud, but they have no idea that they're reading a tract that was written by a Marxist, Quaker, utopian socialist who also happened to believe in the metaphysics of the mind. He was a complex guy, Waddles, and a lovely man. He died 1 year after the book came out. He died of tuberculosis while he was on a trip to Tennessee, and you know, when he was eulogized in his hometown newspaper in Fort Wayne, Indiana, they called him one of the best-known socialists in the state, and they mentioned only as an afterthought that he also wrote certain works on spirituality and the uses of the mind. But today, Wallace Waddles is one of the most influential mystical writers in America, in the world, perhaps, more than a century after his death.
Well, it doesn't really surprise me. I think Marxist criticism in the mid-20th century lost its way and is allergic to looking at anything other than materialist analysis. But
yes,
social reform and the spirit world have been hand in hand. I mean, would you give the Marcus Garvey example?
Oh, yeah. Now, this was something really interesting that I came across while I was researching Occult America. I began to find in the speeches of the black nationalist pioneer Marcus Garvey, who was a very popular figure in the first half of the 20th century, references that were unmistakably related to New Thought and positive mind metaphysics. Unmistakable. You know, he would use these phrases like, as a man thinketh, day by day in every way, the black man is growing closer and closer to liberation, you know, phrases that were telltale from the New Thought movement that Garvey used both in a political sense and in a metaphysical sense. And as I started to comb through his speeches and articles, I realized that Garvey, just like Wallace Waddles, was a political radical of the 20th century who was using New Thought as a tool for radical equality. And I was speaking to a historian at UCLA, Robert Hill, who is a terrific scholar, and it was really Hill to whom the credit goes, because he was the one who first placed his finger on this and said, I am seeing in Garvey language that comes out of Wallace Waddles, that comes out of some of these early positive thinking icons. And for decades, we've thought of Marcus Garvey as a political radical, but somebody who had no interest in metaphysics, no time for metaphysics. You know, you would think, apropos of what you were just very rightly saying, given the way that the Marxist critique went in a completely materialist direction, people in this country who know who Marcus Garvey is were raised to think he was just a political radical, the guy who would have no time for the kinds of things that you and I are talking about. They were central to his life, He urged his followers that the struggle for liberation would occur not only on the economic and political front, but with their own conception of themselves, and he supplied them with affirmations and exercises and techniques that were right out of New Thought or positive mind metaphysics. But the problem is, we lose this thread because in the U.S., and probably in Europe as well, most of the mainstream historians, they have no familiarity with any of this mystical history. So when it bubbles up, when its phraseology bubbles up, they don't recognize it. It gets written out of the history books. So if a Marcus Garvey says something like, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, or, the black man must get a scientific view of religion, which is really a New Thought reference, the mainstream historian skips right past that. It's just some weird phrasing that Marcus was using. Doesn't mean anything. But when you start to marry an interest in New Thought, mysticism, the occult, with what's happening in other parts of our history, you see the cross-pollination, and it's incredible. Garvey was as much a figure steeped in mysticism as he was in politics, and we're only just now getting a proper perspective on him.
Well, yeah, this is why I think your books are so fascinating and essential reading, because, I was at an event on to sort of celebrate Frances Yates, because she lived down the corner from where I am in London. And
wow.
there were university types there that were sort of squirming at the idea that Bruno was a magician. It's like, so people putting their hand up going, did he actually practice magic? And they were squirming, and I'm like, guys, he did.
Of course.
They don't have the words for it, and it's an icky thing in the academy to even obliquely suggest that there is not only a reality behind these things, but they've had an impact on history, and they just haven't learned how to. We have to unlearn how to talk about these things.
You're very right, and Frances Yates is a hero to me, really, because when you read her books, you can see how careful she is and how meticulous she is not to want to exaggerate, not to want to make fanciful connections. She's very, very careful. And when she explains to us Bruno's career as both a magician and a scientist, who really stood in the dividing line between the ancient and the modern era, she's so meticulous and she's so careful. And when she completes her argument, you realize how natural it all is. There's nothing for anybody to squirm at or be embarrassed about. His thought system came, in part, out of the occult Renaissance. He was interested in alchemy and ancient astrology and various Egyptian concepts, of which alchemy was, of course, one, as well as being interested in the cycles of the planet, the nature of Earth's position in the solar system, and so forth and so on. And he was able to marry these things, especially in his explorations of heliocentrism, the sun being at the center of our solar system, which obviously he seems to have been right about, and the magical worldview and the scientific worldview were kind of one grain of wood. They weren't these two different blocks of wood. When is anything two different blocks of wood? History doesn't occur in these start and stop rigid compartments with chasms between them. How can there be a chasm? There has to be something there. So the flowing of Egyptian thought, alchemical thought, and modern scientific thought can be found together in one block of wood in the figure of a Bruno or in the figure of an Isaac Newton or some of the others who were founders of the Royal Society. I know I shouldn't be surprised by this. It speaks to a kind of naivete on my part, but it continues to surprise me still that people have difficulty with this, feel uncomfortable or squeamish over this. It was a block of wood. There aren't these interruptions in history. There's a kind of flow. And I think Yates has been one of the great historians who has demonstrated that flow in her work, not in any kind of a forced way, but in a very natural way, that ideas just simply don't stop and start. They melt into one another. That's the human way, and such is the case with the occult and the sciences.
It is, and obviously the case with social reform and the kind of new thought that was growing up in the northeast corner of the U.S. But on that, we should probably, before I just want to give an observation, I find why I consider these books not like they're sequels, but kind of part of the same spectrum, is in a funny way a country that is very ritualistically founded on ideas from the Hermetic underground in Europe would end up with this kind of quasi-hermetic belief system that is so diffused that Americans today will mistake it for reality when it's not. It's a deliberately constructed and built concept, but it gets most of the way to Hermeticism after Emerson. And what I found fascinating when you were talking about, say, Mary Baker Eddy, is that these people had no access. They didn't have the corpus hermeticum. That wasn't readily available in the colonies at the time.
Right. A lot of people say to me, well, gee, New Thought has its roots in Buddhism and Vedic thought and Hermeticism, and what they're detecting are not roots, but they're detecting the remarkable fact that interesting people and seekers, separated by lots of time and geography, will sometimes have the same ideas, which is very interesting and which is very fortifying in a way. But it doesn't mean that they were reading one another, because, as you were alluding, many of the New Thought pioneers here in the U.S., they lived in rural areas. They were self-educated people. There weren't translations of this ancient literature for them to read. They weren't living in the libraries and palaces at Florence. They didn't have access, to the British Museum and so forth. And in many cases, these works were not available in English. The first English translation of the Tao Te Ching was not until, and it was a partial translation at that, was not until 1838. And in the mid 1840s, so far as we can tell, there were about 4 copies of an English translation of the Bhagavad Gita existing in the U.S. at all. People find that hard to believe, but one was in Ralph Waldo Emerson's private library, one was in the library at Harvard, and 2 or maybe 3 others were in private hands, and that was it. So it's not as if Mary Baker Eddy could just go knock on Ralph Waldo Emerson's door and say, can I borrow that Bhagavad Gita from you? Nobody knew it existed. So when you find congruency between New Thought and some of the ancient traditions, that congruency is all the more remarkable because you have seekers coming to that on their own. They have nothing to crib off of. Even translations of the Hermetica wouldn't really start to circulate until well into the Victorian era. So Buddhism, Vedism, Hermeticism, this stuff just wasn't available to the people in some of the mental healing circles and the mesmerist clubs and the spiritualist societies. They might have had the Bible, they had their own experiments, but it wasn't until the 1880s, really, that this material became available. And even then, you would have had to live in a city. People find it hard to believe because they think, well, surely, you had universities, you had schools, not very much. In the mid 19th century, even well-settled areas of the U.S., like New England, you may have had one teaching hospital. You had, a handful of universities that were just getting started, but to have translated literature around, it was quite rare. The first popular translation of Emanuel Swedenborg wasn't even available in America until the mid-1840s. Again, the Gita, you could barely find it. So these people were largely out on their own. So we have to be careful, not to draw hasty connections between the ancient and the modern. The connections are there, but they're found in the intellect of the seeker rather than in some kind of direct family tree.
Yeah, or again, I even push that even further, and it potentially says something very interesting about the underlying reality of what they're all trying to describe, separated by several millennia. And what I think adds extra weight to that, again, I'm very taken by the idea of the fact that you have spiritualist traditions and UFOs and all this stuff happening in an area that also is spewing social reform for almost a century, and then gives the most powerful country on earth a belief system it doesn't even realize it has. There's a more exciting and obviously tenuous, but this is a magic podcast, so I can say it. We may discern a more exciting set of hands playing on the piano next to our own.
Right. It's very interesting. When I first began to learn about all the things that were coming out of the burned over district, this area of central New York State, which is still quite a rural area, by the way, you have social reform. You have new religions, such as Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventism. You have spiritualist societies. You have the women's suffragist movement. Today, the burned-over district and the Hudson Valley, particularly the Hudson Valley, are a hotbed of UFO sightings. There's almost nothing that wasn't there, And if you drive through the burned-over district today, there's some suburban sprawl, some strip malls and things like that, but to a remarkable degree, it's still farmland, some of it very beautiful, some of it very untouched. And you can just stop on the side of the road and say to yourself, what went on here? What was it about this place that inspired the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith, that inspired the Fox sisters to begin their nightly seance sessions, that inspired suffragists like the founders of the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Conference from 1848. All these different kinds of people were there, and they all had one thing in common, which was a familiarity, including Joseph Smith's family, with the magical and hermetic traditions that had crossed the Atlantic from Western Europe and from Central Europe. They all had that in common. That's the one common denominator. And you just look around the burned-over district, and it's a place where it's been preserved, of beautiful hills, beautiful farmland, but there's an edifice of something unseen there. There is. Why this place? It's a snaking road, really, Route 22, between Buffalo in the west, Albany in the east, and maybe there's this 30-mile, 25-mile a perimeter around the road that constitutes the burned-over district. It's not a very big place, but so much came out of there, and the common denominator basically is European Hermeticism. And there's something going on there. There's an edifice there that's unseen, and it's quite remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that brings us, one of the things that it birthed for the world is New Thought. So Mitch, or whatever you want to call it, but Mitch, what is New Thought?
New Thought is the philosophy that thoughts are causative, that your thoughts do more than add up math equations and figure out directions and how to work the latest gadget, but what you think and what you feel and what you dwell upon and what you're emotionally convicted to outpictures in some way in the world. That's the New Thought challenge, that thoughts are causative. And this philosophy, which is known more popularly as the power of positive thinking or the law of attraction or the secret, came out of the New England mental healing movement of the 1830s, 1840s, traveled in many different directions. Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Church of Christian Science, passed through the mental healing movement, later rejected it. She had a variety of doctrinal differences. You have people who were trained and educated by Mary Baker Eddy. They had fissures, they had differences. For varying reasons, they were pushed out of or left her Christian Science movement. They went out in search of their own answers, in search of their own congregation, and those were the people who created what we call New Thought, which is this idea that what you can conceive, you can achieve. And that has become the American creed in many ways. So when Ronald Reagan would say things like, nothing is impossible, or Barack Obama would say, yes, we can, there was something in the American heartstrings that was really pulled by that. Most people who would never think of themselves as New Agers or interested in New Thought or even interested in the power of positive thinking kind of almost automatically agree with those ideas, at least if they like the person from whom they are emanating. And those ideas all sound very American, but they came from the mental healing movement, they came from mesmerism, they came from all these occult experiments that people were engaging in to ask whether there are higher energies of mind, and whether through prayer, meditation, visualizations, other spiritual and mental exercises, you could get in touch with these finer qualities of mind. Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul. By the 1880s, 1890s, you had all kinds of terms out there: divine science, new thought, science of mind, religious science. People were convinced that there was this protocol by which we could heighten the sensibility and the activity of our thoughts to heal the body, to improve relationships, to bring about circumstances, and eventually, of course, as is the favorite American pastime, to bring about wealth. So you had books like The Science of Getting Rich, a whole variety of literature dedicated to prosperity, which now has taken the form of a so-called prosperity gospel here in America, where evangelical figures like a Joel Osteen are preaching this stuff from Sunday morning pulpits to huge audiences. They would disavow any connection to New Thought or the occult or any of the topics we're talking about. It's exactly where they come from. It's exactly where they come from. So, you know, if there's an American philosophy, it's this idea that thoughts are causative. You find it among New Agers, you find it among evangelicals, you find it at all points in between. And it became popularly known as New Thought in the 1890s, although the term New Thought is not widely heard today. You'll more often hear the titles of books like How to Win Friends and Influence People, or Power of Positive Thinking, or, you know, slogans like Yes, We Can. You know, New Thought, Americans tend not to like to think of themselves as being part of a movement. They take the idea and they discard the outer wrapper. So we forget these things, and, you know, you have somebody who says, you know, I don't like New Age, but I sure do like Pat Robertson and his idea of the law of reciprocity, which is just Pat Robertson's reprocessing of the law of attraction. And I'm not even sure he knows it at this point. You know, these people lose their moorings and they forget where they came from. I'm not even sure evangelical movements like Pat Robertson's are aware of anything that we're talking about, because people copycat ideas from one another, and by the time something gets reprocessed enough, the names, you know, originally attached to them, the movements originally attached to them, are forgotten. But we are a New Age nation. I mean, that's where America has taken its most public spirituality from.
Yeah, and I find it genuinely funny, endlessly funny. I hope they never find out, because it's just brilliant to watch.
If they did, they would just find some way to deny it anyway. I do have some respect for the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking in 1952, because Peale was one of the last of the real popularizers who acknowledged some of these mystical roots. You know, in his writings, Peale will make references occasionally to science of mind, unity, Christian Science, the new metaphysics, so to speak. And I appreciated that he acknowledged those roots, but the generation after Peale won't make that acknowledgement.
No, well, speaking of Peale, you read an article recently. The kind of hidden influence of this burned over district window area continues in the form of Donald Trump.
Yeah. Donald Trump is very public about the fact that he loves Norman Vincent Peale. Peale died in late 1993, and Peale was Trump's minister at Marble Collegiate Church here in New York City. Power of Positive Thinking was Peale's book, was a big influence on Trump, as it was on many people. And Peale was a minister to lots of powerful folk. You know, Peale was a conservative, and and his congregation attracted prominent conservatives. It included Richard Nixon, members of President Dwight Eisenhower's family, and members of the Trump family. And Trump is very forthright about calling Peele an influence. And this has revived a debate over Peele here in the U.S., where journalists have been saying since the 1950s, see, I told you that this guy Peele is just teaching people how to be narcissists, how to be shallow, how to be self-promoters. And the article that I wrote recently for the Religion News Service is, Peele was lots and lots of things. There were many people who passed through his congregation who could speak very forthrightly and a lot more quietly than Donald Trump about how he saved their marriage, or he got them out of addiction, or he helped them through a time of great grief and difficulty and depression. The truth is, Peele had lots of serviceable ideas to offer people. And Peele's gift was that he was able to take all these strands of American mysticism and reprocess them through a scriptural language with which the church-going public was comfortable in America. So it was Norman Vincent Peale who really put mysticism into the American living room. If you read his book, Power of Positive Thinking, you'll have the same experience, this shock of recognition that I described when I found Marxist language in Wallace D. Wattles. You'll see a lot of occult terms that you're very familiar with, including Hermetic terms. He'll make references to music of the spheres. He'll make references to mesmerist terms, like the mind having these magnetic influences. And you're thinking to yourself, my God, is this a conservative a Dutch Reformed minister, or am I reading some popularizer of Pythagoras and Hermetic ideas? Because you really will find telltale terms. You'll find language from Swedenborg. Peele was capable of taking these mystical ideas and finding congruency for them in Scripture, which you could argue is probably a pretty natural thing to do. And he had a very popular writing style, and lo and behold, this guy had ordinary American men and women who would never for a second think of themselves as having anything to do with the occult, reading and practicing popularized versions of Swedenborgian, Hermetic, and mesmeric thought. And Peele acknowledged his New Thought roots. He didn't dwell on it. He wasn't trying to wave a flag for it, but he did acknowledge it. And along comes Donald Trump, and he has reintroduced Norman Vincent Peale into the American lexicon. Most of what's written about Peale has been in journalism and academia is negative, but as you can tell from my remarks, I take a broader view of him, and that's the subject of my recent piece for the Religion News Service.
Yeah, and it's also in the book, of course, because you said the word popularized. Peele's book was not unpopular.
Hugely popular and known around the world. Today there's a life-size bronze statue of Peele out in front of Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue here in New York City. There are tourists from all over the world, Scandinavia, all parts of Europe, Japan, South Korea, who stop in front and they're taking pictures. Oh, Norman Vincent Peale. Everyone's heard of him. He became famous around the world. With that fame, Peele experienced a certain agony, which was that many journalists and critics saw him as a foil. They saw him as everything that was shallow and silly and paper-thin in American spirituality and American intellectual thought. And for all the fame and riches he got, he also saw his name knocked around quite a bit, and that caused him some degree of agony. But he was, and remains, I suppose, a household name. You'd be amazed at the diversity of people from around the world who stop in front of this bronze statue and they recognize it instantly. There's no big sign there, and there they are taking pictures. So, Peele probably became perhaps the most famous minister in American history.
Yeah, and let's close the loop back to the spirit interaction of the Northeast or burned over district. It's interesting to me if any of that is true, that thoughts do in some sense have a reality, a capacity to structure reality. What I find interesting about Peele is that he is a kind of inheritor, as you say, he kind of transduced a lot of that new thought and then ended up in basically every home in America.
Yeah.
And so these thoughts have made it into every single house into America, more than 50 years ago, and are now in people's heads. And if they have a reality, that's a very successful kind of play.
It's remarkable. And when people say things like, think positive, be confident, never give up, all these things we think of as nice little slogans that appear on coffee mugs and refrigerator magnets and in page-a-day calendars. But that mentality, which is so familiar, which feels like part of the scenery, it was not always with us. It was not always with us. It was really when these mental experimenters, these mind metaphysics pioneers, began to experiment with the uses of the mind. That, starting, say, 150 years ago in the modern sense, is what gave birth to this whole affirmative mind movement. So it seems as familiar, as a glass of milk. But the truth is that kind of formulation was not always with us. 200 years ago, if you said to somebody in early America, oh, gee, you really have to think positive and then maybe you'll have a good outcome, they would have looked at you like you were crazy. That kind of language and cause and effect didn't really have a place in the modern American mind at that time. Now, again, it's just as familiar as any landmark you could imagine, and it feels like it's always been with us. But it hasn't always been with us. It's a branch from this Hermeticism that was rediscovered in the occult Renaissance, that traveled the Atlantic, and that really worked its way into the groundwater of this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Mitch, I have to let you go. Thank you very much for your time. But other than your own two wonderful books, if people who should be fascinated by this who are listening, what would constitute a New Thought library? Like, what texts should people read? Obviously, Power of Positive Thinking, but what else?
Power of Positive Thinking, certainly. The works of Neville Goddard, who wrote under the name Neville, are wonderful. I think he should be read. He wrote a book called Awakened Imagination that I'm very fond of, another short book called The Power of Awareness that I think very highly of. Any of the books of Ernest Holmes are worth reading. There's a little pamphlet that was produced anonymously in this country in 1926 called It Works. It's all of 28 pages. I think that is worth reading. I'm quite fond of a little lecture that you can find on YouTube called The Strangest Secret by an American radio announcer named Earl Nightingale. People can cue that up, The Strangest Secret, and read that. There's a little pamphlet called The Mental Equivalent by a minister named Emmett Fox that I recommend. Those are some of the popular pieces of literature that I think really summarize the thoughts are causative outlook. Although Neville, I think, was intellectually somebody who occupied his own plateau in the New Thought world. And if somebody wants to kind of explore this stuff from its most radical vantage point, and also from the point of view of somebody who could argue it very elegantly and with just a beautiful persuasiveness, check out the works of Neville Goddard. I can't recommend those highly enough.
Nice one. And for people who'd like to know more about your books, Mitch, where might they find out more?
They can find them anywhere books are sold. If you want to visit me online or see what I'm up to, just throw my name into Google. You can find my website, mitchhorowitz.com. My piece on Norman Vincent Peale is up with the Religion News Service right now. I have lots of articles. You can find links to my books on my website. And just throw my name into Google and you can get your start.
Nice one. And this will all be in the show notes. So once again, Mitch, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Mitch Horowitz, ladies and gentlemen. We got him for an hour before he had to rush off to another meeting. So this would have been the last question, but it's really more of an observation. The reason I asked Mitch's advice on which New Thought books listeners should read or be aware of is not because the ideas they contain are endorsed wholesale. I think it's important in the occult to understand where ideas that are often mistaken for reality come from. Once you have the measure of their provenance, once you sort of see where they begin and end, you can extract the utility from them without falling into their worldview. So it's that all-important return of context again, which unquestionably is the key word at the center of this current magical revival. And speaking of context, I sometimes get asked, which is weird when you think about it, the best place to start for like a true history of America. And for me, it's Mitch's two books combined with Peter Levender's Sinister Forces series. Once you've got them under your belt, you'll have all the sort of high strange touch points you need to really sort of, I guess, pass whatever other history books, be they the normal ones, quote unquote, or like the more woolly alternate history ones, through a more appropriate phenomenological / animistic lens. And with that said, we come to the end of this week's show. If you like it, then please do subscribe in iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or on YouTube. You'll find all the show notes at runesoup.com, and the lion's share of commentary tends to happen in the RuneSoup Facebook page. Or you can drop me a line on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.